Good evening. You haven't tuned into an episode of the Sky at Night with Patrick Moore. At design meetings, modern technology. At design meetings, I've been informed positively and negatively that architects come from another planet in terms of our design ideas and perspectives. Well, I can assure you we don't. We have our feet solidly based on planet Earth by gravity. So, Ian, can you hear me? Wave if you can hear me. What do you see, Ian? Don't worry, we discuss it later. The human brain, marvelous and sophisticated. It has been established by psychologists that the right-hand side of the brain governs creative, fluid processes, and the left-hand side, rational, structured processes. Architectural psychology. For the purposes of this presentation, I'll be exploring and simplifying two schools of thought in architectural psychology: structuralism and Gestalt psychology. These are the simplistic ways of explaining the simplistic way of explaining these two theories are: structuralism deals with the development of a design from a micro perspective, maybe at atomic level upwards. Gestalt psychology deals with the development of a design from a macro perspective, a global overview. The intersecting diagram area, yellow zone, represents the ideal balanced architectural brain and mind, possessing both Gestalt and structuralist attributes. So here we have the micro and the macro, and the best of both worlds is what an ideal balanced architect has. So delving into the ideal balanced yellow zone of an architectural brain, you have the two parallel mindsets operating at the same time. For example, micro areas dealing with concept and brief, macro areas dealing with the global site and scheme context. This is very simplistic modeling of a couple of architectural psychology theories, which you're welcome to explore in greater detail. With these parameters in mind, how do these translate to the real world? I can expect you would ask. I fundamentally believe that architecture is about understanding people, the site, and construction holistically. So I will lightly outline project briefs, design concepts, and refer to aspects relating to site analysis and building construction. So let's review four very different schemes, varying in scale, complexity, and architectural sector, which I have designed, developed, and delivered. Gary Thomas, what do you see there? Don't say anything at the moment. We'll talk about it later. The Landmark Hotel, Marylebone, London. The Landmark Hotel, what was the brief? To refurbish a former prestigious Grade 2 listed Edwardian railway hotel, once described as a temple of luxury. At the time the project commenced, it had seen better days and had become British Rail's Dowdy headquarters. The project involved transforming it to a renewed, no expense spared, luxurious oasis in the heart of London. So what are we looking at here? What was the design strategy? The strategy was essentially to increase the number of rooms and suites up to from formerly 200 to 308. The former external courtyard space was covered with a new glazed roof and associated portal frame. We went to transform the modest palm court, which is shown here. This was the former modest palm court, and that was expanded to create a new piazza winter garden atrium space with mature palm trees. We also created new internal atrium elevations, which were faced with Pyrox cement boarding, and there was the creation of a new subterranean car park. So what I want to try and constantly reiterate, the architectural brain thinks on a macro scale as well as the micro scale. So it's the concept of the building in its entirety, but the elements at the same time that make up the building. So moving on to a typical plan. The innovations with this particular scheme involve the creation of the green, if I refer to the green rectangles, not creation of, the green rectangles here on the left-hand screen here we are, represent prefabricated bathroom pods, which were manufactured in Germany. The red zone, which this model of bathroom pods is replicated on all of the floors throughout the hotel. It was a precursor to MMC, modern methods of construction, and it was one of the first major commercial hotels in central London to use that strategy. The red zone here on the right represents the east and west wings, which had their widths, the actual width of each wing was respectively expanded. So this is a construction drawing which shows the wing being expanded to allow for an increase in floor plate depth and the accommodation of bigger or larger bedroom suites. So here we have the representation here on the left of what was done with the new atrium facades. We recreated, in the spirit of the existing vocabulary of the architecture of the building, we created new atrium facades which were made out of cementitious board, pyrox boarding, and mold formed shapes, for in particular around the arches and circular windows and keystones within the elevation vocabulary. So again, we're looking at the whole here as opposed to, it's the whole, with the Gestalt theory, looking at the whole, the sum of the parts, as opposed to the parts in isolation. That's what an architect thinks about. We look at the parts, we look at the components, and we look at it as a whole. Just moving on to the next. So here's a space. This is one of the this is the main piazza space as it was described in our strategy. We created a new portal frame structure to support new patent glazed roof that spanned over the former open air courtyard. This courtyard was exposed before. It was white glazed tiles, very unremarkable appearance, but now we've transformed it into a new atrium space with the new supporting structure. So who's the next person? Paul Singh, what do you see? We'll talk about it later. Next scheme, former police station at Eaglesfield Street in Maryport, Cumbria. What was the brief? The brief was simply set by a developer. He wanted me to maximize the land value with planning gain and adapt a very unusual footprint, which was a former police station with cells and an adjacent stable site. This particular Victorian Gothic building it was literally like the Doctor Who's TARDIS. From the outside, it appears very small, but as you'll see, next picture, it's got a variety of modes. So this is the mode. So fundamentally, we're looking at the transformation of this footprint. I'll just move on to the next slide to give you an appearance on the. You can see how the site proper varies, and the very quirky vocabulary that made up this building. But it's very deceptive because it was much deeper at the back. The plan will give you a much clearer understanding of what constitutes the footprint. So here we are. The modules, this modular axonometric represents the different components that made up the footprint. We have a courthouse. The former planning consisted of a courthouse with accommodation, the cell block area, the ancillary support area for the police station, and it was a former stable area here and a garage, again, another stable area here. And that's in relation to, if we flick back to see up the slope and beyond, they've got a much larger zone beyond. The strategy behind the development of this plan was to ensure that all the adjacent spaces or adjacent apartments always had access to a courtyard. No matter how small, there was a courtyard adjacent to key spaces, irrespective of where the aspect of each apartment was. So you have street-facing apartments and then almost landlocked apartments, but it has actually got a courtyard to provide natural ventilation, views, and limited vistas from even back in the heart of the plan. It's a very deep plan, and the circulation had to be accommodated within the existing footprint, or the existing footprint had to accommodate the plan's configuration. So moving on to the next slide. So also in terms of context, the scheme was looking to integrate, this slide's moved slightly. There is to encourage a pedestrian passage through the site, which would allow transfer for pedestrians through. This had been sealed off by the council, the former police authority, with a solid brick wall. So it's to encourage through passage of pedestrians here, as well as making provision of the new housing here, this was formerly a large stable, and accommodation of additional accommodation at the first floor level of the existing building. So looking at the components that constitute the building, again, what I tried to do with this diagram is to break down the components that constitute different types of residents. You've got the orange are mezzanine apartments, the blue are single-story apartments, the yellow is another apartment, and then you've got a rear apartment here, the courtyard spaces highlighted in yellow here, and then the two residential properties at the back, which slot in here into essentially to marry up with the existing grain of the housing, adjacent housing. So moving on. Again, what I'm trying to show here is that it's the sum of the parts that constitutes the scheme in this particular arrangement. It's very it's very inconsistent elevations. They go up, down, gable ends, hipped ends, all constituting the same building, but they make up these almost micro components which constitute the scheme. So these knit together almost like a Jenga toy. Well, it's not a toy, it's a building. It's almost like, conceptually, it's like a Jenga composition, but this is how the building was actually configured, and it was to make the most of this configuration was the objective, and at the same time satisfy the developers' requirements. The component, the ultimate achievement was 11 development units that came out of this scheme. So he was very pleased with that. So moving on, show another configuration, another elevation that's showing the juxtaposition of different elevations, different scales, and it was all part of the existing vocabulary in this particular building. Very unusual texture and composition, which had to sort of mesh with what was already there. So moving on, time swiftly. Diana Crouch, what do you see? Don't worry, we'll talk about it later. The next scheme. 5 and 6, the Embankment Putney. The brief for this particular project, I'll show you the location. It's a unique location in London, the riverside by Putney, not far from Putney. The Oxford-Cambridge boat launch is actually here. It's a bit further down here. Oxford-Cambridge boat race takes place along here. So if you watch it regularly, which will be coming up, you'll recognize it. So it's essentially these two properties on a short terrace. The developer had a particular brief. Let me just flick back. He wanted the brief was to create two distinctive prime residential homes from two terrace properties. So let's flick back to this. So what was the strategy? The strategy, what was the context? The context you can see, the strategy being to create a family home and a slightly more open planned, modern free-flowing home with more really free-flowing spaces as opposed to conventional confined box-like spaces which you'd have in a traditional Victorian property. So the strategy was then discussed with the developer was to create one property that could be easily occupied by a family with, and the other property would potentially be a couple who didn't really have kids, because of its location, there wasn't the opportunity, there isn't an opportunity to have large gardens. So the rooftop becomes the prime space for entertainment and enjoyment here. So other ideas that were being explored with this scheme was juxtaposition of old and new building fabric, the interplay of opaque and transparent elements, and optimizing views and vistas. So the following slide should pick up these elements as well. So let me just move on to that to give you a better idea what I was speaking about. So here we are. We've got the juxtaposition of the old fabric, the new modern fabric, and a sort of dealing with a buffer of transition between old and new with glass, which is a common theme that we tend to do as architects. And at the same time, providing an opportunity for more amenity on the rooftop with rooftop studios. So these models look at how conceptually in my brain or in our brains we could conceive that the existing building is broken down. You have your rooftop element here. Sorry, go back. We have the rear element here, which was totally renewed, which actually does represent the way in which the construction took place for this particular project. The original fabric was retained here, the blue element. Sorry about that, technical. The original fabric was retained with the blue component, and the new components are the purple elements. So here we have 2 rooftop studios and then 2 new extensions to each respective property. So let's have a look at the appearance and the detailing. This is the roof, sort of image of the roof, one of the rooftop studios. There are 2 flanking studios. Maybe I've gone a bit quickly. I might drop back a bit just to show you the axonometric again. Here we go. You've got the 2 rooftop studios, glazed rooftop studios, and the extension to the rear. And then we have the River Thames running in front of the properties here. So let's move on. So next image is the interplay. It's representing the interplay of transparent. We like to use, I suppose we like to use other words to describe our conceptual elements. We use different vocabulary as architects do, I suppose, to capture the sort of the magic which we're trying, and the poetry which we're trying to achieve. So we've got the interplay of transparent and opaque elements, which essentially is the glass, the brick, and the render. So they're giving that interplay and that dynamism, that the potential reading of floating masses, floating elements, and the magic of light behind it, illuminating these elements. So let's move on to the next. This is more of an architectural realization presentation. So here we have the footprint of both of the properties. The one that I've just shown you on the flank, on the corner here, is represented by this property here. The River Thames runs in front here, the embankment, and the second property is here. So number 5 and number 6. So also looking at how space can be actually configured in a different context with the modern house, or the so-called modern house. The staircase was configured in the center of the plan to enable accommodation to act as a buffer between the old property, the old fabric, which is here, the new fabric is here. In so doing, removing the staircase out of the heart of the footprint, so it frees up much more open spaces and to give a sort of a different dynamic from the more traditional footprint with your, Victorian house, front door, staircase wrapping its way up as you go through the property, which eats into the footprint, as you can see. So these were ideas that were being explored at the same time as trying to satisfy a client brief, which was very well received by the developer in the end. So here's an illustration of the rooftop configuration with the studios and how the studios are accessed internally. And there's quite a terrace there for both properties, which allows achieves one of the key objectives with views and vistas on this unique location at Putney on the Riverside. These are the existing, this is the existing fabric with the introduction of the new studios on top. And here's the existing element here with a new studio on top, back, and the extension to the rear buffered with the glass and the new extension. So it's the interplay between new and old, and it's buffered with a glass element. It gives you that dialogue between solid and transparent components. Paul Singh, what do you see? Tell me later.
Do you want me to tell you now?
Tell me later.
Okay.
Okay. ICU, the intensive care unit, Charing Cross Hospital at Hammersmith. So moving on, this is the, if you're not familiar with it, this is the tower which constitutes the, Charing Cross Hospital in Hammersmith. So what was the brief in this instance? The brief in this instance, the client brief from the senior consultant was he wanted quality, which at the time was not prevalent in much of the NHS. And I don't want your typical NHS unit. His key drivers for this particular project was that he wanted to attract and retain high caliber staff from around the world. He literally went around the world to get the nurses, junior house doctors, junior consultants. He wanted state-of-the-art medical equipment, and he wanted this environment to be outstanding. So what was special about this? Well, this project involved extensive briefing with the clinical team and consultants. It was used ultimately as a professional case study in the Architect's Handbook, and it's also used. The design is used as an exemplar for the HBN Health Building Note Standard for ICUs. So let's look at the concept and how that translates to reality. So here we have, at the heart of the unit is the staff base. The staff base element was what the consultant wanted as the core of the unit, to maximize upon observation of patients and access to patients. So the multi-bed areas, so this is the schematic. So the multi-bed areas are around here. Likewise, they're shown here in the architectural plan. The multi-bed areas, we have two isolation negative and positive pressure rooms for immunosuppressive patients, I believe it was called. And then we have all the ancillary support and facilities at the back. And what was important, one of the key considerations that the consultant wanted, he didn't want his staff having to, when they were treating a patient, he didn't want them to be distracted, to have to go off to a remote storeroom to retrieve some sort of medical supply or sundry or feed. He wanted that in close proximity to each patient. And so that was achieved by having localized storage, which is around the perimeter of the unit. What's also quite special about this unit at the time is that all the key medical gases, monitoring, body monitoring, and IT sensors are suspended from medical pendants, which are held aloft from the ceiling. So you've got no trailing leads for people to dislodge or disconnect by mistake. And it also allows for a variety of procedures, because with a patient housed in this unit, the practitioners have a variety of procedures they have to take. Sometimes they will approach a patient, or they need to undertake a procedure from the foot of the bed. Sometimes it's from the head of the bed. Sometimes it's at the side of the bed, and sometimes it's practitioners functioning in these areas all at the same time. And this is why the consultant wanted the flexibility in operation in this environment. So this was crucial to delivering the medical care that he wanted. So I'll move on to the next slide. So let's look at the components. The components of the plan, again, back to the architectural psychological perspective in terms of theory. We've got a unit in its most basic form as a core with a multi-bed space around the perimeter. but in its actual execution, the core is maintained, which is the blue zone, and the pink zone are the multi-bed facilities. And then we've got the other zones, the other elements, the other components constituting the ancillary support. We've got another operating theatre. We've got a specialist operating theatre contained within the unit. We've got its own pharmacy, and we've got its own dirty and clean utility, which removes the need to leave the unit. So everything's contained within the unit. So we've got ancillary space clustering around the key spaces that they're serving, with appropriate adjacencies and functions working at the same time. So this is, again, just to recap on some of the concepts that I've tried to convey in garbled or otherwise form. So if we can move back to slide here. I'll just pick this up right at the beginning of the presentation. Architectural psychology. For the purpose of the presentation, as I said, we were exploring, and I will be exploring and simplifying two schools of thought of architectural psychology. One being structuralism, the second one being Gestalt psychology. The simplest way of these being expressed are structuralism deals with the development of a design from a microscopic perspective, so as an atomic building upwards, whereas Gestalt psychology has a more global macroscopic view of design. So again, the representation here is of the balanced, dare I say, the ideal balanced architectural brain and mind will possess both of these, and the narrative and projection is of these two concepts performing as one. So next time you see an architect in a design team meeting and you wonder, what's he thinking about? Where's he going with that idea? He's probably thinking about two things at the same time, and if not two, probably more. So at this point in juncture, I feel my presentation is finished. I've tried to keep strictly to our time allocation, and I'm happy to take any questions, and I'll try and answer them. Thank you very much.
Hi, Femi, I have a question.
Hello.
Particularly resonated with me the micro and macro part of your presentation. I read an article recently, and for me, the two things that I made sense of as a builder were technical and creative, and maybe applying those, if you like, skill sets to various architects. What it said in the article was that there were certain architects who had the design flair, which I would deem the creative architects. Yep. And then there were other architects who knew technically how they were going to actually physically build it and make it work. So I think this definitely, to use your, micro and macro thing, I see it as technical and creative. Can you try and sort of rationalize that slightly for me? Because I'm quite intrigued about it.
Well, it's interesting that you say that. I've always striven myself to have a balanced approach. People say, oh yes, we don't want an architect who's very bohemian, doesn't know how to consider all the technical aspects, the services, how we're going to coordinate the actual operations on site. And it's all well and good being creative, but I feel you've got to have a balance to be practical. That's my perspective. This is more, you could talk with our dear friend Ian and Gary. They may well, and Craig, they may well have a particular. Craig might say he's more technical. Ian might say he's more creative. But I feel that a balanced approach is the best, really.
Interesting. That's before you
You're
introduce.
talking about services.
Sorry, all of that's before you introduce a structural engineer or a mechanical and electrical services engineer, and that just puts a whole other spin on things.
At conceptual stage, you do consider these. Well, I do. You consider them at the same time. It's not a building in isolation and then services afterwards. It's an integrated environment. That's what you're creating. That's how I perceive it. You're creating an integrated environment, and it's a holistic approach where you don't just think of services as an add-on later. You know, if you're dealing with an eco home for somebody, they want underfloor heating, and you've got to incorporate the underfloor heating pipes and the manifold and the pump. You don't want to be left in a position where you've got no position to put the manifold, you've got nowhere to put the pump, and then you've got to create a box out for it. No, it's the whole. You know what I'm trying to say. So it's a considered approach. That's the most important thing, is a considered approach.
Femi, while you're talking about services, I noticed your house on the side of the Thames there seemed to have two flues coming out of one elevation, which was the house, I presume, on the left-hand side. That would indicate to me that the boiler for house number 6 was passing through the space of house number 5. How do you get away with that, if I'm right in what I've seen?
That flue was as a consequence of the client wanting to have a natural fireplace, and that flue was that was done after my participation. He did that himself. The client did that, and he was very lucky he didn't have an enforcement notice issued. So it was actually to increase the draft for the fireplaces that flue was introduced. It's not a boiler flue. It's a draft to increase the draft on the fireplaces. Yeah.
Thank you.
So it's not my preferred component. The client actually did that himself off his own work.
So Femi, that leads on to sort of the question I was going to ask, which is, having gone through that process of balance the macro and the bigger picture on a project, how frustrating is it to then have? Is it a torment when the client then wants to change things at the last minute, or changes things themselves afterwards when you've spent all that time on a scheme?
Well, it's not. You've got to always have that flexibility of mind to accommodate change. You know, you can't be. It can be frustrating, but you've got to be adept enough to say, okay, the client wants to, and if the client is introducing change, and then naturally they'll be covered with a caveat for a variation, really. But one has got to accommodate change. The client is the client. You can't say no, you're not having it. It's not. We're not all fortunate enough to be in a position of, say, Mies van der Rohe or Miss van der Rohe or Frank Lloyd Wright to dictate what the client has, because in those instances the clients are subordinate to the architect. But that's not usually the case.
But you can often tell them how much it's going to cost to do the variation at the end, at the last minute, and they'll go, "Oh, in that case, maybe not." I didn't say that.
Okay. Any other?
The spatial diagrams you've shown on your presentation, or party diagrams, were they something you done specifically for this presentation, or do you use that as a way of showing? Yes.
Aid with communication of the concepts. That they were specifically prepared, because some of those plans they would not read in isolation as well as with a 3D representation. 3D representation gives a much more rounded perspective, I feel, than and which is a tool now which we're all using in the profession now. We're using 3D more to communicate ideas and concepts to clients, as opposed to just the 2D plans, sections, and elevations that we used to do. We're using the most common program is SketchUp. If it was SketchUp or Revit, these are the tools that we're using to communicate with clients concepts and ideas that we're trying to deliver and satisfy a brief with. Yeah.
Can I just ask, Femi, I mean, buildings we've seen have all been existing buildings where you've had to work with the space you've got. Do you think it's a different discipline if you're given just a plot of land and have to decide how to start from scratch?
It's always easier when you've got a new build. It's always easier because you set the parameters. It's a different discipline, isn't it? If you're working to a context, you've got to work creatively. Whereas you can actually define when you're creating a new build, you can define your whole terms of reference, the planning grid, the structural grid, the elements that what I didn't do in this talk, which so just to save at this point to caveat, the brief I didn't expand enough upon the fact that the brief and the site inform the design. You know, these are not elements that are looked at retrospectively or shoehorned. But from the outset, from day one, your site and brief and consultation with your client informs the design. So yes, it can be challenging, but it's easy. I think it's much easier to have a new build than to have to work within a context. You've got confines of a different maybe planning grid, different spaces, different disciplines and different configurations that set the design in the first place.
I can tell you're a postmodernist. Sorry, I was going to say, because the classic modernist approach is to say the site doesn't matter. We'll put a little glass box exactly perfect on any site anywhere, and then have a bit of landscape around it until you hit whatever streets or other bits of landscape have to be around.
Well, that glass box is arbitrary. You know, it's not responding to a site, is it? You know.
That's the whole point. Yeah, it's the modernist ideal is you have the perfect building, sort of standing on whatever happens to be there. It's immaterial what's around you. You build the perfect example.
But you're not responding to a context then, or responding to a site.
That's the failure of modernism usually.
That's the failure of modernism.
Even though I'm a postmodernist at heart. Sorry, we're getting well off the subject. We're getting to sort of a stylistic debate here, I'm afraid.
It's good to have some sort of architectural debate once in a while.
It's a bit macro, perhaps. Yeah.
So any other questions, queries that you've always wanted to ask an architect and never had the opportunity? No?
Well, thank you very much, Femi, for your presentation. Very
ink blots.
Can I just ask you, what is that picture then? What is the blobby picture, Femi?
The blobby picture. Okay, I'll tell you what the blobby picture is.
It's a Rochard.
Yes,
is it what?
Well, how do you pronounce it? Rochard or Rochard?
Yes, it is. It is. Master Singh. Is Master Singh still there?
Yes, I am. Yes, I've been dying to tell you.
Master Singh is a Rosho, isn't it?
Yeah. It's a psychological sort of test, isn't it?
Yes. So
how do you pronounce it precisely, though?
It depends. If we can do a round robin, going down from I can't see the names of.
I'm going to look it up.
Yeah, Deborah, what do you see?
I thought it was like a big fangy wolf thing.
A wolf. So I've got derivations here. If you see an animal's face, the symbols associated with faces and elephants give us information about how we confront problems and what our initial reactions when faced with challenges. If you've perceived an animal's face and you were fearful, for example, this may show that you've experienced some fear and panic at the thought of looking into the face of your inner issues. An elephant may represent the elephant within the room or the big issue you all ignore. I'll run through the other interpretations. If you see a bat, seeing a bat can be a healthy acknowledgement of your dark side.
Oh, I saw a moth. Does that count?
I saw a bat. I don't want to hear any more, Femi. I thought it was a giant mutant bat.
Oh my God, it's like a psychopathic lawyer. Oh God.
You may either feel drained or unbalanced.
I do now.
If you saw a butterfly or a moth, butterflies often symbolize transformation and transition, the ability to change, grow, and overcome. Moths can be symbolic of feeling ugly, overlooked, or a wallflower. They can
Henry!
All of the above!
symbolize our irritants, what annoys us, and our weaknesses. Perhaps you have a tendency to view yourself negatively and highlight your flaws rather than focus on your strengths and positive characteristics. So if you saw an angel as a symbol, angels typically represent protection, goodness, purity, and spirituality. Since this was in reaction to the first card, it is possible you turn to angels in times of stress or view yourself as someone striving to possess the traits of an angel. So everyone sees something different there.
Sounds more like the horoscopes.